So
Okay.
we can start, I think.
야, 이제 시작해도 되겠지. Thank you, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Kaan Kangal for the first one of the Global Marxism online talks, which is organized by Social Science Career Research Project, named as Searching for the Post-Capitalist Alternatives in the Anthropocene through the Innovation of Marxism. Let me introduce the presenter, Professor Kaan Kangal. He is the Associate Professor of Department of Philosophy, Nanjing University in People's Republic of China. He has written a range of articles to tackle with the dialectics, hermeneutics, metaphysics, and also Marx and Engels research. His work on Marxist-born notebooks won the David Riazanov Prize 2019. His most recent publication is Friedrich Engels and the Dialectics of Nature, Palgrave published this year. To make a special feature to commemorate the bicentennial year of the birth of Engels, Marxism 21, only one quarterly journal specialized in Marxism in South Korea, I contributed an article titled as Nature is a Proof of Dialectics, Engels' Dialectics of Nature and New Materialism. While constructing it, I had the chances to read his works and learned a lot from his meticulous research and critical engagement in called Engels debate. I am really honored to be with him for today's talk. Today's title of talk is Engels' Philosophy in Dialectics of Nature. I think Professor Kaan will deal with some major features of dialectics of nature in the process of becoming a controversial and the proper book as is known in the history of Marxism, which caused an array of debates according to Kaan named as Engels problem or Engels debate. It also raised the storming quarrels in Marxist circles around the relationship between Marx and Engels. I think it's non-productive to judge whether it is right to have Engels against Marx or Engels with Marx. But since long, it has served to rethink and to rebuild the identity and difference of Marxist dialectical materialism. Today, I hope to hear Professor Kaan Kangal's compelling revaluation of dialectics and materialism specific to Engels' theoretical struggles. Kaan Kangal, as the presenter, will have around 40 minutes for talk, and then I will raise a couple of questions. Please welcome Professor Kaan Kangal.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. And I also would like to thank you for organizing the lecture series. It is really an amazing opportunity to be involved in this. So let me now go back to my PPT. I'm going to share my screen. One second, please. Yeah, I should be able to share my screen, but the option is somehow gone. I'm not sure why.
Mhm.
Does that have to do with the settings of? Yeah, now I cannot share. Oh, okay, here. One second, in a minute. Okay, so you can see the screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. So today I will be discussing a couple of issues I have explored in my book that was published this year in February. The topic was Friedrich Engels and the Dialectics of Nature. Now, this research concerns partially the textual history of this book, that is, why Engels came to write this book. That is why he undertook this task of working on the so-called dialectics of nature. What was his procedures in dealing with this issue? What was his main intentions, motives in delving into this giant field? On the one side, a dialectical philosophy inheriting the the German classical tradition. On the other hand, keeping an eye on the contemporary developments of natural sciences in 19th century and looking for the interconnections between dialectical philosophy in as it took a certain shape in the hands of the socialist theoreticians such as Marx, Engels, but also other socialist theoreticians in mainly in Germany, and the interconnection between philosophy and natural sciences. So, assuming that most of the participants are no philosophers or have no philosophical background, I decided to uh, go into a little textual history, the editorial history and the writing history, and I will say a couple of things on the editorial discussions, and I will say a couple of things on the uh, philosophical insights of Engels' so-called book. And it will turn out that every single thing we assume to be true is actually dubious, that is suspicious or even ambiguous. What we call a book is actually not a book at all. That we are used to think that Dialectics of Nature is a book, although it isn't, or that the Dialectics of Nature is the title of this book, although it isn't, and that Dialectics of Nature is one book, although it isn't, and so on. So the entire debate that concerns Dialectics of Nature is really full of contradictions. Now, some people tend to exploit these contradictions to the disadvantage of Marxist theory. My intention is actually exactly the opposite, the diametrical opposite of that intention. My intention is to exploit these contradictions as fruitful puzzles um, that encourages further debate and further research in this field named Dialectics of Nature from a contemporary standpoint. So I am asking some questions. At least I have been asking questions to myself, and those questions are not necessarily identical with the questions that Engels has been asking himself. And indeed, new questions are brought about by the old problems, and Engels is definitely very useful and insightful with regards to formulating these problems, even if he's not able to solve these problems to our own satisfaction. So the topic dialectics is indeed huge, and it is extremely old. It is almost as old as the Greek philosophy. And if you just look at the German tradition of dialectics, the classical German philosophy, it is also indeed a vast field, let alone uh, what covers Marx, Engels, lives and intellectual adventures. So, what I will be saying about dialectics will be limited to his so called 1878 plan, and I am going to explain what this means. That is, what is 1878 plan? That is the plan from the year 1878. So, on the one side, I do have the intention to clarify this so-called plan in dialectics of nature, and then I will narrow down my scope to the concept of dialectics in that plan. So the lecture today is divided into a few fields, a few spheres that starts with editions of dialectics of nature. This is indeed some interesting textual history, editorial history of dialectics of nature. We are going to see that dialectics of nature indeed subject to an intellectual, editorial, political, ideological evolution that will bring us to the birth of this book. Before that, it was not a book at all. It was a bunch of manuscripts, and in the hands of the editors, it became a book. So it is indeed quite intriguing to see the exact procedure of how that became something that is going to be called a book. Next, I'm going to say a couple of things about the plans. Now, we are used to think that there is actually only one plan, one list of contents of this book, because it has been presented as such by the editors rather than by Engels. And we are going to see that there is indeed that kind of conflict between what we are told to be the case, namely that there was one book and one plan. Though, if you look at the manuscripts themselves, you would see that there are four different plans and they point to different directions in Engels' understanding, undertaking of dialectics of nature. Next, I will question the matter of the issue of whether we have to do with one book or seven projects. And again, this results to this questioning results from my own return to Engels' own manuscripts. And what I have found is definitely that we do not have to do with one book. This issue is quite similar to Marx's 1844 manuscripts, the so-called economic philosophical manuscripts, on one side. On the other side, it is also similar to the case of the so-called German ideology, right? So in the texts that they have been written by Marx and Engels turn out to be and turn out to take extremely different shapes that are hardly identifiable with the original states of the manuscripts. So this is really a hypothetical issue. I have put a question mark at the end of this proposition that is one book or seven projects. I think it is quite possible to deny this one book issue, although it has always been presented as such. And because of that reason, in Mega 2, we have two versions, because there was a fight between East German editors of Dialectics of Nature and the Soviet editors. And Soviet editors insisted that we should keep the systematic quality of Engels' book to make it less vulnerable against those who are so ready to attack and dismiss Engels' dialectics and play him off against Marx dialectics. So this is, of course, not my intention, but I am pretty keen to know how to grasp the state of affairs that concerns the real status of the manuscripts, and I came to the conviction that we may be able to speak of seven projects, and that has to do rather with the textual quality of the manuscripts. Next, I will say a couple of things on philosophy, that is Engels' parameters, and by parameters I mean a couple of oppositions around which Engels' undertaking is clustering, and these parameters concern some very central oppositions: the opposition between dialectics and metaphysics, and materialism and idealism, and finally the interconnection between philosophy and natural sciences. And in the last section, I will say a couple of things about this so-called Engels problem. Although I personally do not think that there is a so-called Engels problem, we have to admit the historical fact that people conceit of Engels as a problem and reflected it reflected him as a problem, which is why I take up the task to go back to the roots of that. So this is going to be really a extremely short summary given the limit of my time. In that regard, probably I will be able to go back to the issues that I'm going to skip during my lecture when I get to questions. So let me start with with a few editions. So we have actually around 10 different editions until we had the final edition. The first edition was the Marx Engels archive, published in 1925-26. David Ryazanov, the Russian first editor of Mega 1, was in charge of preparing the different manuscripts of Marx and Engels, and he was publishing the so-called Marx Engels archive, and that was published as a 2-volume, and that covered a variety of manuscripts by Marx and Engels, including the second volume, that published a couple of selections from all the manuscripts that have been written by Engels within the scope of Dialectics of Nature. So this goes back to 1925-26. Next, we have a Mega 1 edition, and this was a special edition published in 1935. And keep in mind that there were some other editions, I'm just skipping that, between 1925 and 35, within these 10 years. There were also some other editions, but I'm just skipping them for reasons of simplicity. This special edition was indeed a special edition, interestingly, not part of Mega 1. And Mega 1 at the time was published for the reasons of documenting everything that has been written by Marx Engels in this form of historical critical edition. So it is curious that they developed a special volume that contained anti-Turing and Dialectics of Nature in the same volume. Now, one curious thing about this is that we always, or we usually tend to think as if these two texts, these two works belong together. Now, the reason for that are probably two. The first reason is understandably that the content of these two works, namely Anti-Turing and Dialectics of Nature, are quite close, although not identical, because Anti-Turing also goes into some critical discussions on bourgeois political economy, whereby Dialectics of Nature is understandably limited to dialectical philosophy, history of philosophy, and natural sciences. And the other reason why we tend to think that these two texts belong together is because they are published together in the same volumes, and this has been something like a tradition that you would see in many popular editions of Marx and Engels' collected works. These two texts are published together, which is why whenever people talk about Engels' Dialectics or Dialectics of Nature, they repeatedly refer to Anti-Turing, although that comes along with this danger of confusing one text with the another, because these are really not identical texts. And the third reason is obviously because Engels made use of some research material that he had accumulated when he was doing research on Dialectics of Nature. And that accumulated research material was partially used in Anti-Turing. And when Anti-Turing was finished, when the writing process of Anti-Turing was finished, he also borrowed some materials from Turing after 1878 and used them in his continuing research on Dialectics of Nature. Okay, so we have next we have this very famous 1940 English edition. This is the first edition that was translated and edited by Clemens Dutt with the preface and notes by the British biologist Haldane. And then we have the less known dual bilingual edition prepared for publication by Bonifati Kedrov. The Russian edition was prepared in 1973, and the German was prepared for publication in 1979. Now, the interesting thing about Kedrov's edition is that the internal structure is entirely different from how it came out in the hands of the other editions, such as Mega 1 or the classical canonical Marx Engels collected works. And also, the title is different. The title of Kedrov's edition is Friedrich Engels on Dialectics of Natural Sciences. And this has to do with the basic conviction of Kedrov that this project of Engels is about natural sciences, and a theoretical approach of Engels to natural sciences is the core logic of his undertaking. And this was quite radically different from the classical understanding, the classical account of Engels' Dialectics of Nature, because the traditional understanding is this is more like a philosophy of nature and philosophy of natural sciences rather than a theoretical dialectics of natural sciences. And you already see that the basic convictions, basic ideological beliefs can play a huge role in the editorial job of structuring this text and presenting this text. And indeed, this is an individual initiative that we find in Kedrov that led him to present an alternative edition as somewhat a silent protest against the common and widely circulated belief that we have to do in Engels with a rather philosophical undertaking than a natural scientific undertaking. Finally, we have the Mega 2 edition. This is the, let's say, a fun edition because it contains these dual versions. The one is the chronological version. The other one is the systematic version. And this is not the first time that we come across this kind of dual versions in the same mega volume. So, for instance, it is the same case with 1844 manuscripts of Marx, whereby you have this chronological version and then the so-called systematic. And systematic versioning depends obviously on the theoretical beliefs and the ideological interests of the editorial group. And we also do know that was something like a struggle or a disagreement between the German and Soviet editors, and Soviet editors were they had a much stronger liking for the systematic presentation, as I said, for the reasons of making Engels less vulnerable against the background of those who are so ready to attack Engels and play Marx's dialectics off against Engels' dialectics of nature. And German side was more in favor of the chronological presentation for the reason of the academic standards of the Mega 2, because Mega 2 is following this the standard of presenting text in the chronological states of affairs, in the chronological sequence, which is why they also wanted to apply this criterion to the presentation of dialectics of nature. And indeed, on the one side, there is the editorial task. On the other side, there is the ideological concern. And because of this clash, or because of this incompatibility of these two expectations or standards, we have two versions of the same text published in the same volume. So this already shows pretty much the conflictual background or the polemical context of Engels and all these problems that Engels text can be charged for. Just keep in mind that the debate, the Engels problem, is much deeper than that, and I am pretty confident to say that there's hardly another text that caused this much controversy as Engels' dialectics of nature. Okay, so now a couple of words about the birth of this book. We do know that David Riazano gave the task to a couple of people of his to research in European archives to find all the manuscripts or texts written by Marx and Engels for his project of preparing this historical critical edition of the works of Marx and Engels. So one of the people in Ryazano's team was Boris Nikolaevsky. Nikolaevsky was in charge of looking for many different manuscripts, and he came across a couple of interesting things that he reported to Ryazanov in 1920s. And he was mentioning in his letter correspondences that he found that there are some works by Engels on natural sciences and dialectical philosophy that he found in Eduard Bernstein's archives. So Bernstein was at the time the literary estate of Marx and Engels' works, and he was preparing articles and books for publication. And indeed, Nikolaevsky reported to Ryazanov about this discovery, and indeed, of course, Ryazanov was pretty much interested in all that. Now, at the time in 1895-96, Bernstein already published one article by Engels that was originally part of Dialectics of Nature, that was the part played by labor in the transition from ape to man. And about 2-3 years later, he also published the other article, Natural Science in the Spirit of the World, in the spirit world. And the question was for Ryazanov to publish all of it rather than what was more or less complete, such as these more or less complete articles written by Engels. Ryazanov wanted to publish everything that was written there, that could be found with regards to dialectics of nature and theory of natural sciences. So now that's the reason why Bernstein contacted two physicists in 1910s and 20s. The first physicist Bernstein contacted was Leo Arons, that was a physicist and a member of the Social Democrat Party in Germany. And the assessment of Arons was negative for the reason that these manuscripts are largely outdated. And according to Bernstein's own speculation, Arons had a distaste for speculative dialectical philosophy of the German tradition, which would be a further additional reason for Arons' negative assessment. A few years later, Bernstein contacted Albert Einstein, and Einstein came to a similar conclusion, quite similar to that of Arons, though Einstein said that besides the fact that the manuscripts are indeed outdated with regards to the contemporary developments of physics, they offer some interesting insights into Engels' intellectual journey. So he's in favor of publishing all that. Just around this time, when this conversation between Einstein and Bernstein was taking place, Ryazanov was indeed competing against Bernstein, and he was being as quick as possible to take over all the literary estate and publish everything he could find written by Marx and Engels. Okay, so what we have in terms of textual manuscripts is actually, before it became a book, published as a book, is actually four folders in total, and they have been named by Engels as Dialectics and Natural Science, Natural Research and Dialectics, Dialectics of Nature, and Mathematics and Natural Science Diversa. Now, the interesting thing is that you see the third folder here, namely Dialectics of Nature, contains this title, Dialectics of Nature. Though, philosophically, it is the least interesting folder, actually, because most of the material you would find, and most of the most famous materials, textual materials you would find, are in the first folder, namely in Dialectics and Natural Science. So I have prepared when I was writing the book, I have prepared a table of all the manuscripts and where to find what. Now you see a few columns here in this table. On the left side, on the very left side, I have distinguished various phases. In total, these are 11 phases, divided according to the writing periods. Mega 2 tends to be aesthetically more clean. The editors divide the whole thing into two main periods and then subdivide them into 4 further periods respectively. But 11 phases seem to be more accurate. In the second column from the left, you see the manuscript numbers. In the third one, you see the dates of the manuscripts, that is when Engels wrote which manuscript. In the second column from right, you see the contents of folders with regards to the manuscript numbers, according to first, second, and third, fourth folders. And on the very right side, you see ND number. This ND refers to Naturdialektik. And that Naturdialektik is actually a title that Engels has given to the first 94 manuscripts of his Dialectics of Nature. Now, the interesting thing is, uh, dialectics of nature is a term does not show up much in the main text. In fact, I am aware of two or three occasions when this term is used by Engels explicitly, even without a clear philosophical or theoretical context. He is sometimes speaking of dialectics of nature, as in dialectic der Natur or Naturdialektik, namely nature dialectics. But other than these main titles, you don't see this term much occurring in the main text. Now, I'm mentioning this for a reason, because when you look at the history of this debate, people tend to think that the meaning of nature dialectics of dialectics of nature is rather self-evident. Though when you really look at the text and question that very issue, what is dialectics of nature, then you run into this difficulty of proving exactly what you think of dialectics of nature by means of the texts written by Engels, right? So what dialectics of nature is definitely open to interpretation. And one problem in Engels' research is admitting that there is a matter of interpretation or a problem of interpretation, that the very term, the central term named dialectics of nature, is open to interpretation. Okay, finally, and I am also checking my time. Finally, we have a diversity of opinions when this book ended. We have three options. The first option is that Engels finished this undertaking in 1882, according to Mega 1 and 2 standards, presumably because there is a correspondence between Marx and Engels. And Engels is telling Marx that he should come, he should finish his Dialectics of Nature very soon. So I'm guessing that's the reason why the dating goes back to 1882. And then in Marx and Engels archive, the last manuscript dates from 1892. And the reason is because Marx and Engels archive, their version of Dialectics of Nature, contains one manuscript, and that manuscript is Engels' memorial of Karl Schorlemmer. That Karl Schorlemmer is a communist chemist, a comrade, and close friend of Marx and Engels. And when Schorlemmer died, Engels wrote this short article um, for Schorlemmer. So that is the reason. And I believe personally that the date should be 1886 because that is the time when Engels' hands touched the bunch of manuscripts for the last time, when he reorganized all the manuscripts, put them into 4 different folders, gave different titles to all these different folders, and used one manuscript section from his famous article on Ludwig Feuerbach and the end of classical German philosophy. So some other interesting things. Before Dialectics of Nature was called Dialectics of Nature, it was called different things. For example, in 1925 edition, we have the title Nature Dialectics. And in German, it was called Naturdialektik. In 1927, they changed the title from Nature Dialectics to Dialectics and Nature, which was Dialektik und Natur. And in 1935 edition, we have this final titling, namely Dialectics of Nature, and that was the Dialectic der Natur. And this change in the terminology already refers to instability of the editor's understanding and changeability, transformability of editor's understanding of what this book is about. So we have 4 plans. I'm going to do a little bit more quick because I am running out of time. So we have in total four different plans or list of contents rather than one. This 1878 plan, 1880 plan, second folder and third folder. So on the second and third folders, we find list of contents written by Engels. And 1878 plan is known as the main plan, and 1880 plan is interpreted by editors invariably as the subplan or the second plan or additional plan. So on the left, you see the plan 1878. This is usually put in the very beginning of all the standard editions of Dialectics of Nature. And the plan 1880, you see on the right side, is interpreted as the subplan, although there is no indication made by Engels that the one on the right side is some sort of an explication of the one on the left side, which is indeed curious, because that rather points to the fact that Engels might have narrowed down his scope and broke his bunch of material into smaller chunks and reduced the whole thing to a more manageable size to write short pieces rather than one huge book. And here you see the list of contents of the second folder and third folder, all pointing to different directions of research. And probably this also meant that the undertaking went into and divided into smaller projects. So this brings me to the questioning of whether we should, given these facts, whether we should be speaking of one book or 7 different projects. Now, the number 7 comes from the fact that the first 98 manuscripts have been titled by Engels as Notre Dialectic, which points to one compact initial undertaking. The other one is the other possibility would be the planned 1878. And this points to the possibility that Engels decided to reorganize the entire bunch of manuscripts that have been written so far until September 1879 and plan 1880. This can also mean that the reorganization was then rearranged, and the first folder, second folder, and third folder, fourth folder, this division took place in 1886 at the very end of the entire undertaking of Engels. And the question, it is extremely open to interpretation whether Engels decided to rearrange the entire thing in order to write one single book, or the rearrangement took place for reducing the size of the manuscripts to a manageable order for the smaller pieces that he has foreseen to write down. So now a little bit philosophy. As I said, I will limit myself to 1878 plan and dialectics, the concept of dialectics in 1878 plan. So we find 3 different things, 3 interesting things, 3 elements in this plan. The one is the definition of dialectics, the other one is laws of dialectics, and finally a crucial distinction between dialectics and its opposite, and that is a problem indeed, as I will discuss soon, its opposite, namely metaphysics. So the definition is indeed a metaphysical definition, science of universal interconnection. This is how Engels defined dialectics there. The distinction is, curiously, that this was supposed to be the opposite of metaphysics. And now this kind of thing, namely universal interconnection as a research objective, has been the traditional research objective of the classical metaphysics. And interestingly, Engels is counterposing his dialectics to metaphysics, and this is one confusing thing. Now, another interesting detail here is that we find 4 laws rather than 3, because most of the time, people say that Engels had 3 laws rather than 4. But if you look at this plan, you would see transformation, quantity, quality, reciprocal interpretation of polar opposites, and transformation into each other when carried to extremes. Third, development through contradiction, negation of negation. And fourth, the spiral form of development. This fourth one, which is, I think, the most interesting one, has been dropped in a manuscript written after this, around 1880, in a manuscript called Dialectics. So in that manuscript, the laws of dialectics have been reduced to 3. So now Engels is working with 3 oppositions, or with 3 parameters. One is the opposition between metaphysics and dialectics. The second one is idealism and materialism. And third one is philosophy and natural sciences. Now, Engels' intention is, terminologically, if not argumentatively, is to make a case for dialectics against metaphysics and for materialism against idealism. And he needs that to bridge the divide between philosophy and natural sciences. And I am saying that these oppositions do not really work. That I do believe that metaphysics and dialectics, as well as idealism and materialism are pretty compatible if you look at the way Hegel is defining these two terms, these curious terms such as metaphysics and idealism. In fact, they are much closer to each other, that is, in metaphysics and dialectics, as well as idealism and materialism, are much closer than Engels as well as Marx would like to admit. And this is indeed, on the one side, a huge problem. On the other side, this problem comes along with a fruitful debate in favor of solving this issue for Marxist philosophy. And this is indeed crucial for establishing this interconnection between philosophy and natural sciences. So I would define the, one second, I would define the idealism and then materialism, idealism and metaphysics, and then show the interconnection between these definitions and what Engels is exactly saying. So idealism can be defined as singular finite entities have no veritable being without collective dependence and natural mutual interaction among each other. Mutual interdependence of finite parts is an infinitely self-developing totality within which the singular parts play the role of individual moments of the whole. So this is pointing to the interconnection between finite and infinite. Indeed, infinity is a huge topic in philosophy, and idealism says that finite reality is just part of this infinite world, infinite self-developing totality. And it would be an idealism to think that the whole reality is constrained to the finitude. For instance, the room in which you are is a finite reality, though this is not the entire reality. So idealism would like to overcome that limitedness or constraint expressed by finitude. Now, this is pretty much what Engels understands from materialism. Here is a quote from Dialectics of Nature: matter as such and motion as such have not yet been seen or otherwise experienced by anyone, but only the various actually existing material things and forms of motion. Matter is nothing but the totality of material things from which this concept is abstracted, and motion as such nothing but the totality of all sensuously perceptible forms of motion. So this is pretty compatible with the way Hegel is defining idealism, insofar as this reality is a material reality. It contains these principles of substantiality, processuality, and relationality. Then Engels and Hegel are actually on the same page argumentatively, but not terminologically, because what Hegel says in terms of idealism, Engels would attach that or order that into his understanding of materialism. So this is indeed a huge problem when the old Marxists try to distinguish and separate them into different camps. Next, metaphysics. So here's a definition of metaphysics based on Hegel. Rational foundations of sciences demand a rigorous inquiry into the fundamental structures of reality and our understanding of them. In order to conduct such an inquiry, we need to construct a categorical framework that explicitly formulates and self-critically revises the conceptual tools in use in order to improve our command of the ways we experience and think of the world. Now, this is to say that philosophy has to be informing natural sciences from Engels' point of view, and natural sciences have to be philosophically sophisticated. Now, let's look at Engels. Engels is saying that natural scientists believe that they free themselves from philosophy by ignoring it or abusing it. They cannot, however, make any headway without thought, and for thought, they need thought determinations. But they take these categories unreflectingly from the common consciousness of so-called educated persons, which is dominated by the relics of long obsolete philosophies. Now, Engels is saying that there's no escape from philosophy. One way or another, you are going to be dominated by a philosophy. The question is by which philosophy you would like to be dominated. That is, which philosophy you are going to actively or passively employ that informs your theoretical and practical undertakings. And the theory and practice of natural sciences were already informed by a variety of philosophies, philosophical traditions. And Engels' point was to create a new channel and enable the dialectical philosophy intervene into the way the theory and practice of applied natural sciences were informed. So this is also indeed quite accurate with regards to how Hegel is defining metaphysics. In that regard, I do not see a strict contrast between Hegel's metaphysics and Engels' dialectics. So you can define dialectics in three ways in Engels. One would be dialectics as a theory of totality. This would be quite close to Hegel's metaphysics and idealism. The second one is dialectics as a relational structure. This would be this is usually associated with the unity of opposites, resolution of contradictions, interrelationality and nature, and so on and so forth. So this is the practical applicational empirical field of dialectics. And finally, dialectics as a method of understanding, or dialectics as a cognitive method that is applied. And this is usually the case in Marx discussions. So for instance, the relationship between abstract and concrete, that would be an example for this dialectics as a method. So one persisting problem in this whole undertaking of Engels is the theoretical status of dialectics, and this is crucial for understanding the character of dialectics with regards to this interconnection between philosophy and natural sciences. As I said, the issue of the oppositions between metaphysics and dialectics on one side, and idealism and materialism on the other side, is crucial for bridging the divide between philosophy and natural sciences. So, because these issues are not solved, we also have to do with these further issues of the theoretical status of the dialectics, namely whether dialectics is a super science apart from particular sciences, and whether dialectics is an abstraction from particular relational structures. So, how much more do I have in terms of time? Your microphone is off.
Actually, you have to finish now, but we will have more than 10 minutes.
Okay, let me say then 3 sentences. Engels' problem. This is one example of whether we can find the connection between Marx and Engels. There is a good case. In Marx Capital, we have this famous proposition. It is a contradiction, for example, for one body to continuously fall into another and just constantly fly away from it. The ellipse is one of the forms of movement in which this contradiction is actualized just as much as it is solved. This passage proves that there is no divergence between Marx and Engels, because Marx agrees that there are contradictions in nature. And in this case, we have to do with the planetary motion, a planet revolving around the sun, and it is subject to two opposite tendencies. One is to fall into the sun, the other one is fly away from the sun. And yes, indeed, the rest was about the Engels problem, but I am leaving that now. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much for your impressive presentation to investigate the rich editorial history of dialectics of nature and its related issue. I'm sure that your work should widen and enlarge the interest for Engels, saving from infamous reputation as positivist and mechanist and naturalist, and conversely an idealist. Even more than ever, we need to be a materialist to connect and unify the nature and the society, living in the age of the Anthropocene or capitalism. It will be very helpful to appropriate Engels' dialectical materialism. So we don't have enough time, so I'd like to raise just one question. Following the dialectics constructed by Engels, do you think that the dialectics of nature and the dialectics of society could be autonomous and independent one? Otherwise, the two of them are constitutionally united and articulated. Then we don't need a disparate dialectics. I'd like to know your opinion.
So the question is, according to Engels, right?
Yeah.
Engels is, and I am being extremely straightforward, Engels is indecisive. You can say, yes, there's one unified dialectics that applies to nature and society, and no, there is no unified dialectics that applies both to nature and society. And that is indeed the problem. Now, if you look at the discussion of in the dialectics of nature, he's explicitly saying that if there is motion, then dialectics applies to nature, and he tries to elaborate on that with regards to the existing contradictions in nature and society. But then, on the other side, this is extremely superficial, and it requires further elaboration. That is, how to make use, how to make fruitful use of this kind of generalization. On the one side, it is quite justified to make generalizations, and indeed, he's quite right to say that all these three laws or four laws apply to nature and society. For instance, negation of negation or contradiction. You find these cases both in nature and society. But on the other side, what exactly are we going to learn from these overgeneralizations, right? So on the one side, he seems to be justified in applying these common laws that we tend to find. But on the other side, it is so general, without further elaboration, that we are left rather helpless to gain some further insights into understanding uh, what we are going to do with these dialectical laws, right? So that would be what I would say. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer. Yeah, we don't have enough time, but we only around 4 or 5 minutes. Is there any questions in the audiences? We can get one question. Or you can write down on the chatting window.
Well, I'm not sure whether we have to be that strict in terms of time. Yes, I do understand this was planned for 1 hour, but maybe we
Yeah.
can add
Yeah,
a
we can have 3 minutes. Yeah, 3 or 4 minutes. Yeah.
up to you.
Okay, then there is no more any questions. I have to finish our session. Once again, thank you for everyone for joining our talks, and thank you a lot for Kaan Kangal to deliver much insightful talk. The global Marxism talks will continue every single month for examining the current conjuncture through Marxist research. Please pay attention to coming up all of the talks. Then we will close today's talk. Goodbye, everyone, and see you in next talk. Bye-bye.
Okay, see you.
Yeah, see you.